Hello everyone, welcome to another video, and in this one we'll have a look at flaps 3 or flaps 4 landing, how to decide which one to use. In order to answer that question, we're going to have a look at the pros and cons of config 3 compared to config 4. One of the biggest pros of config 3 is that it actually saves around 20 to 30 kilograms of fuel for every approach. And the reason behind that is config 3 has a flap angle of about 20 degrees compared to the flap 4 config, which has about 35 degrees. So here you can see config 3 at 20 degrees. Compare that to the flaps 4 at 35 degrees, and you can see it is a substantial difference. So config 3 will mean a lot less drag, hence lower RPM, less fuel flow. Lower drag also means that the missed approach climb gradient will be better with the config 3. And of course that also will give you a better wind shear recovery potential. Less drag obviously means less required thrust, hence the RPM of the engines will be lower, and that will then lead to less noise for people on the ground. So what are the cons of the config 3 compared to config 4? One of the major cons is that config 3 will lead to less lift compared to config 4, meaning the aircraft will have to fly faster in order to compensate that lower lift. The difference in speeds is around about 5 knots config 3 compared to config 4, as you can see in this example. A higher approach speed will of course then mean a longer required landing distance and more wear on the brakes. And that will be in those cases where the landing distance available isn't that great. Another thing to consider is the fact that a config 3 landing will give you a higher required pitch angle compared to a config 4. And that may lead to less margin against tail strike, although I will admit this is more prominent in the A321, which is a lot longer compared to the A320. Now we're not talking about a huge difference in pitch, so to show you that here in example, config 4 gives you about 2.5 to 3 degree pitch,
1000.
while the config 3 will give you around about 4.5 to 5 degree pitch angle during final approach. Not a huge difference in numbers, however, when it comes to the tail strike clearance, it can make a substantial difference. Another downside may be the fact that due to the lower drag when you are on config 3 is that it could be difficult to maintain the approach speed if you have a steeper than normal 3 degree glide slope, let's say 3.5 or even 4 degrees, or if you have tailwind. So these conditions will make it more difficult to maintain the speed or recapture any overspeed situations because of the fact that you have less drag, i.e. low engine RPM anyways, having then to compensate that with a almost idle power setting. So looking at config 4, it's obviously the reverse to config 3. However, there's one thing I would like to point out, that a lower pitch angle can help see the runway or approach lights earlier in case you have some bad visibility. So when to use config 3 and when to use config 4? Well, when I was flying the 737, I remember that a standard flap setting was 30 degrees, and you would rarely go with flap 40. And that's simply because you felt the increased drag when you have flaps 40 compared to flaps 30. Now the same aerodynamic principle applies to the A320. Hence, when you plan your approach, you should ask yourself, is there anything that speaks against a config 3 landing? Now, of course, it does assume that it doesn't matter if you use config 3 or config 4, the landing distance required is less than the landing distance available. So then come the points, do we have tailwind? Is there a steeper than normal glide slope? Are the outside temperatures very high, coupled with a very short ground time, and so on. So if those things are no factor, well, then go ahead with a config 3 landing. And that concludes this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, and give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. As always, a big thank you to all my members and the financial supporters of my channel. Stay tuned, there will be more videos coming. Until then, as always, enjoy your flight sim, and I wish you all happy landings.